She stepped off that train weighing nearly 300 pounds, and every single person on that platform laughed, not behind their hands, not quietly, out loud, without shame, the way people laugh when they've decided someone doesn't deserve basic decency. She heard every word. She kept walking anyway. What those people didn't know, what they couldn't see through their cruelty, was that the man waiting for her at the edge of that platform was the most feared soul in the entire Black Ridge territory. And by the time this story ends, both of them would remake that mountain from the ground up. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Stay with us until the very end. This one's worth it. The summer of 1883 arrived at Black Ridge like a drunk stumbling through a doorway, loud, clumsy, and carrying something nobody had planned for. The morning train from St. Louis came shrieking into Cedar Falls Station 20 minutes late, trailing a long tail of white steam that dissolved into the mountain air before it even had time to form a proper cloud. The platform was already crowded, ranchers waiting on livestock supplies, merchants expecting dry goods. A handful of women from the Cedar Falls Ladies' Auxiliary standing near the far end in their pressed bonnets, arms folded, watching everything with the particular kind of attention that people reserve for things they intend to judge. The men climbed down first. That was the custom. Boots hit the wooden platform with authority, the sound of people who belonged somewhere and knew it. Children came next, handed down by mothers still managing the steps. Carpet bags thudded onto the platform. Trunks scraped across wood. The ordinary noise of arrivals, ordinary and forgettable. Then the laughter started. It began with two men standing near the water barrel, cowhands from the look of them, trail-worn and mean in the offhand way that bored men get mean when they have an audience. One of them nudged the other and tilted his chin toward the second train car. The other looked. And then he smiled first, that slow, spreading smile that means something ugly is coming. "Lord Almighty," the taller one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Look at the size of her." She was still on the train steps when the comment reached her, one large hand gripping the iron railing, one foot testing the platform below, moving carefully, the way any sensible person moves when the steps are narrow and the drop is not nothing. Her name was Delilah Boone, and she was 31 years old, and she had heard variations of that particular tone, that specific pitch of cruelty disguised as observation, for so long that it had stopped landing in her chest the way it once had. These days it landed somewhere lower, somewhere she'd built a thick floor over. You felt it. You didn't fall through it. She stepped down onto the platform. She was a large woman. There was no other way to say it, and she had long since stopped trying to find softer words for it. Broad through the shoulders, heavy through the hips. Her traveling dress was good quality, not fine, but well made, a deep burgundy wool that she had sewn herself during the 3-week journey west, because the dress she'd arrived in St. Louis with had split along one seam somewhere in Ohio, and she'd spent 2 nights at a boarding house with needle and thread, refusing to arrive looking like she'd lost a fight with her own clothes. Thick auburn hair was pinned beneath a traveling bonnet that had seen better decades but sat straight on her head. Her face was broad and plain, with the kind of lines that come not from age but from years of holding a neutral expression over difficult feelings. She stepped onto the platform and raised her chin, and the laughter spread the way these things do. One person to the next, like fire-jumping brush. Poor thing, she'd take up 2 seats on that train? Brock ordered himself a wife, and they sent him a whole homestead. She'll never make it through a Black Ridge winter. Mountain will eat her alive. The ladies' auxiliary women didn't laugh. They did something worse. They looked away. The particular erasure of people who find someone beneath the effort of contempt. Delilah heard every word. She pulled a folded letter from her coat pocket, checked the name written there, and looked down the length of the platform. She was looking for Brock Maddox. She spotted him immediately. You couldn't miss the man. He stood at the far end of the platform, apart from the crowd the way large predators are always apart from things. Not by choice entirely, but because the space around them clears on its own. He was enormous. Not just tall, though he was that, nearly 7 feet when he stood straight, and he rarely slouched. But it was the width of him that stopped people. Shoulders that belonged on something that pulled plows. Hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same granite that made up the Black Ridge peaks above town. A face that had been weathered past the point where you could call it young or old. Just hard, like the mountains had pressed themselves into his features over years of looking directly at them. He wore a dark wool coat, trail-worn and patched at one elbow. His hat was pulled low. He stood with his arms at his sides, not moving, watching the train with an expression that gave away nothing at all. The crowd had left a wide circle around him, naturally, the way water moves around a boulder. Delilah looked at the letter, looked at the man. She walked toward him. The laughter followed her down the platform, but she kept her eyes on Brock Maddox and her pace steady, and her chin where she'd put it. The cowhands near the water barrel went quiet as she passed them, not out of respect, but because they weren't entirely sure what they were seeing. A woman walking like she owned the ground under her feet, moving toward the most feared man in Black Ridge territory without the slightest visible hesitation. She stopped in front of him. Up close, he was even larger than he'd looked from the far end of the platform. The top of her head barely reached his chest. He was looking down at her with an expression that she couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not welcoming, just watchful, the way a man looks at something he hasn't made up his mind about yet. "You're Brock Maddox?" she said. Her voice was clear. Not loud, but clear, with the particular quality of a voice that has learned not to ask permission to be heard. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice came out low and careful, like he didn't use it often, and wasn't entirely sure it would cooperate. "Good." She folded the letter and returned it to her coat pocket. "Then I suppose you're my husband now." Silence dropped over that end of the platform like a stone into water. Brock Maddox stared at her. He had been corresponding with the Mountain Frontier Marriage Agency out of Denver for nearly 8 months. He had written 6 letters. He had received 6 in return. The letters had been practical, careful, honest in the way that letters between strangers trying to build something tend to be honest. Which is to say, more honest than conversation, but less honest than silence. He had told her about the ranch, about the winters, about the isolation. He had warned her 3 separate times, in 3 separate letters, that Black Ridge was not a place for people who needed comfort. She had written back each time to say she'd never had much use for comfort anyway. He had expected, despite the letters, someone softer, someone who would step off the train looking apologetic, the way people who know they're about to be judged sometimes look apologetic in advance. He had expected someone who needed reassurance. Instead, here was this woman, standing in front of him with a folded letter and a straight spine, looking up at him like she was the one doing him a favor, which, he was rapidly beginning to suspect, she might be. "I got a wagon," he said finally. "Then let's load it," she replied. They loaded her belongings in near silence, which suited both of them fine. She traveled light for a woman moving permanently to a new territory. 2 trunks, a canvas bag, and a wooden crate she'd packed herself that turned out to contain, when Brock lifted it and found it heavier than expected, an entire collection of medical and herbal references, 3 books on soil composition, and a leather-bound journal filled with handwriting too small to read at a glance. "You a doctor?" he asked, not meaning it as a judgment. "No," she said, "but I spent 4 years as a caretaker on my uncle's farm after my parents died. You learn fast or people suffer. I learned fast." He put the crate in the wagon bed without another word. The townspeople watched them load the wagon. Most of them tried to look like they weren't watching, which meant they were watching with intense focus while pretending to find other things very interesting. 2 women near the mercantile kept their voices low, but not low enough. "She's going to last 2 winters at most. A woman that size in Black Ridge, she'll break an ankle on the first ice, and that'll be the end of it." Shame, really. Brock Maddox finally finds someone desperate enough to marry him, and look what the agency sends. Desperate people take what desperate people can get, I suppose. Brock heard them. He was loading the last trunk and he stopped for just a moment, just long enough for his jaw to tighten, and then he kept moving. Delilah was on the other side of the wagon, tying down a canvas cover over her trunks. She glanced up at him across the wagon bed. "You heard them," she said. It wasn't a question. "I heard them," he confirmed. She pulled the canvas tight and knotted it with efficient, practiced hands. "I'm going to guess you've been hearing things like that your whole life, too." He thought about that. About the way rooms had always gone quiet when he entered them. About the way parents pulled their children closer when he walked through Cedar Falls. About the number of times he'd seen fear light up in someone's eyes before they'd ever exchanged a word with him. "Different kind of things," he said. Same category, she replied, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. The road to Black Ridge was not a road so much as a suggestion. It rose from Cedar Falls in a series of switchbacks that clung to the mountainside with what felt like genuine uncertainty, switching from packed dirt to loose shale to patches of frozen mud that the summer sun hadn't reached yet because the cliff faces above them blocked the light for most of the day. The trail was barely wide enough for the wagon in places, with a drop on the right side that a person didn't want to look at directly. Brock drove. Delilah sat beside him, watching the terrain with the focused attention of someone who is filing information away for future use. They didn't talk much for the first hour. The mountain demanded attention. The horses needed guiding, the trail needed watching, and the wind that came funneling through the canyon gaps carried a bite that had no right belonging to a summer afternoon. Delilah had put on a heavier coat without being asked, reading the air correctly before they'd even left the valley floor. She was, Brock noticed, observant. She watched everything, not nervously the way newcomers usually watch the mountain, scanning for threats they didn't understand. She watched it the way a person watches something they intend to understand eventually. 3 hours into the climb, the trail narrowed around a blind curve where the mountain shoulder jutted out and the right wheel of the wagon dropped off the packed edge of the trail, the whole vehicle tilting hard toward the ravine below, before the horses scrambled and Brock wrenched the reins and the wagon clawed back to level ground. Delilah's hand had shot out and grabbed the seat brace without making a sound. No scream, no gasp. She held on until they were level and then released the brace and resettled her skirt. "That's the widow's elbow," Brock said, his pulse still running a little fast. "Lost a supply wagon there 2 winters ago." "The mountain's trying to make a first impression," Delilah said. He looked at her. "Doesn't scare you?" She turned to look back at the curve they'd come around, at the drop that had been maybe 30 feet of open air. "I grew up in a town where I couldn't walk to the market without somebody making a comment about my body," she said. "A mountain trying to throw me off a cliff is at least honest about it." Something shifted in Brock's expression that he wasn't entirely expecting. It wasn't quite a smile, his face didn't move in that direction easily, but something around his eyes changed. "Most people who come up here," he said, "are scared of Black Ridge for about the first week. How long until they stop being scared?" "Most of them never do," he said. "They just get used to the fear." Delilah nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. "I'm not most people," she said. He didn't reply, but he had begun, in the quiet and practical part of his mind where he made assessments about things that mattered, to believe her. By late afternoon, the canyon opened and the trail leveled briefly onto a wide shelf of land where the ranch came into view. It was not a beautiful property in any conventional sense. The main cabin was large, larger than most, built for someone of Brock's dimensions, with a porch that ran the full width of the front face and timbers thick enough to survive the weather that the territory regularly threw at structures. But years of hard use and limited repair showed. One corner of the barn roof sagged under the memory of past snow loads. The fence line along the north pasture had been patched and repatched until it looked like a thing held together by stubbornness more than any structural principle. The land itself was something else. Even in the hard, angular light of the late afternoon, the valley that cradled the ranch was striking. The kind of landscape that doesn't ask for your opinion about it, that simply exists at a scale that makes human trouble feel appropriately sized. Mountains rose on 3 sides. A creek ran along the eastern boundary, still running clean and clear this late in the season, a sound that carried up to where the wagon had stopped. Brock watched her look at it. He had told himself he didn't care what she thought, that he'd been living here alone for 11 years, and the property was what it was, and he wasn't about to apologize for it to a woman he'd just met. He found, despite himself, that he cared. Delilah sat quiet for a long moment. "The fence line's going to need a full rebuild before winter," she said. "That north section won't hold a hard snow." He blinked. "That's what you notice first?" "I notice it needs work," she said. "That's different from a problem. A problem is something you can't fix." She studied the cabin. "How's the foundation on the south corner?" "Soft," he admitted. "I've been meaning to. We'll get to it." She climbed down from the wagon with the same careful efficiency she'd used on the train steps, got her footing, and looked up at the property with both hands on her hips. "The bones are good," she said. "The bones are really good." He climbed down beside her. "Most women," he said, would have cried. "I'm not most women," she said. "You're going to have to stop being surprised by that eventually." She walked toward the cabin door. Brock Maddox stood beside his wagon on his own property, watching her go, and felt something that took him a moment to identify because it had been so long since he'd felt anything like it. It was something close to hope. He didn't trust it, but he noticed it. The first month was careful. That was the best word for it. Careful. They moved around each other the way people who are strangers but not quite strangers anymore do, with consideration, with awareness, testing the boundaries of what was shared space and what was private. Brock had a system for everything on the ranch. 11 years alone had given him routines that ran like clockwork, built around his own rhythms, and Delilah didn't disrupt them. She watched first. She learned the schedule, what he fed the horses and when, how he rationed the stores for the cold season, what order he worked the morning chores. And then she started helping, not offering, just appearing at the places where extra hands were useful and working without being asked. He came around the barn one morning to find her reinforcing a section of the stall wall he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. She was using a mallet and wooden wedges and doing it correctly, which told him she'd looked at the problem before starting. "You know carpentry?" he said. "My uncle was sick for the last 2 years I cared for him," she said, driving a wedge home with a clean strike. "The hands couldn't stay. I learned what needed learning." He handed her a longer wedge from the tool wall without being asked. That was the beginning of something, though neither of them named it. She was in the kitchen when he came in for the midday meal, and the kitchen was different. Not unrecognizably different, but adjusted. The way a room gets adjusted when someone who knows what they're doing moves into it. Pots in different positions. The fire managed differently, burning hotter with less wood because she'd figured out the draft. A braid of dried herbs he didn't recognize hanging near the window. "What's that?" he asked. "Yarrow and goldenrod," she said. "Good for fever medicine. I'll gather more when I know the terrain better. There's a trading post in Cedar Falls with a medicine man." "I know," she said, setting a bowl in front of him. "This is for when Cedar Falls isn't reachable." He sat down and looked at the bowl. It was rabbit stew, but it was not the rabbit stew he made for himself. There were roots and something green in it that he didn't recognize, and it smelled considerably better than anything he'd produced in this kitchen in recent memory. He ate it without comment. She sat across from him and ate her own bowl. "You're a better cook than I expected," he said finally. "You expected me to be a bad cook?" she asked, not offended, just curious. He wasn't sure how to answer that without revealing that he'd expected, before she arrived, to mostly be disappointed. He settled for honest. "I didn't know what to expect," he said. "That makes 2 of us," she replied, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite dry humor and wasn't quite warmth, but was somewhere useful between the two. Cedar Falls came to Brock Maddox's attention in the 3rd week of Delilah's arrival in the form of Silas Crow, which was never a good sign. Silas Crow was the kind of man who looked like wealth and smelled like threat. Pressed suit, silver watch chain, the particular smile of a person who has been getting his way for long enough that not getting his way has become nearly unthinkable. He owned a third of the valley floor, 4 lumber operations in the surrounding hills, and the only general store in Cedar Falls, which meant he was owed something by nearly everyone in the territory one way or another. He was 48 years old and had the face of a man who had never once doubted his right to take up space. Brock had been crossing through Cedar Falls for supplies when Crow caught him outside the feed merchant. He came with 2 of his men, which was how Crow usually came to conversations he expected to win. "Heard you took a wife," Crow said, leaning against the hitching post with his arms folded. "From back east, they're saying." "You heard right," Brock said. "Agency wife." Crow's smile shifted slightly. "Brave thing, taking on a stranger, especially one with your reputation. I'll pass along the sentiment," Brock said, and picked up the grain bag. "Large woman," Crow continued. That's what they're saying in town. Very large. Must be rough on a man having the whole territory laughing at his household." Brock set the grain bag down. He turned and looked at Crow the way a mountain looks at weather. Present, immovable, waiting. "You come here to say something useful," Brock said, "or are you going to keep working up to it?" Crow's expression shifted to something more direct. The smile stayed but thinned. "I want your eastern pasture," he said. "The section along the creek line. I'll pay fair value, better than fair considering the state of your fences. Things are getting difficult on this mountain, Maddox. Water's drying up, land's getting hard to work. A man of your situation might be better off taking the money and moving on before the mountain makes the decision for him. My situation, Brock said. A struggling ranch, a wife who can't possibly handle a real Black Ridge winter. These are not advantages. Brock picked up the grain bag again. My land's not for sale, he said. Things change, Crow replied pleasantly. Brock walked back to the wagon, loaded the grain, and drove home. That evening he told Delilah about the conversation. He gave it to her straight, the way he gave everything. No softening, no editorializing, just the facts of it as they had happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. How long has he been after your eastern pasture? She asked. 3 years, Brock said. On and off? It's the best water access in this section of the territory. And he mentioned me specifically, she said. Not upset. Processing. He was using you as a pressure point, Brock said, saying I'd be smart to sell before things got harder. The way he said it, he paused, looking for the honest word. He sounded like a man who knows things are about to get harder, whether I sell or not. Delilah set her cup down. Then we need to know what he knows, she said, and we need to be ready before he moves. Brock looked at her across the table. Most people, when they encountered Silas Crow directly for the first time, came away shaken. The man had the particular power of someone who controlled enough of the infrastructure of daily life that crossing him had real consequences. Delilah looked less shaken than she had when the wagon nearly went off the widow's elbow. You're not scared of him, Brock said. I'm taking him seriously, she said. That's different from scared. She looked up. I've met Silas Crow before. Different name, different town, same man. Men like that move on the people around them the same way every time. They start with pressure, then they start taking things, and they do it slow enough that nobody realizes until it's too late that they've lost everything. She folded her hands on the table. We are not going to be slow about this. The fire popped in the grate. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with that particular low sound Black Ridge made at night, a sound Brock had lived with for 11 years and had stopped hearing. He noticed it now. You talk like someone who's been in a fight before, he said. I've been fighting my whole life, she said simply. I just haven't had anyone fighting beside me before. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things, but it landed somewhere inside Brock Maddox that he hadn't expected anything to reach. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, What do you want to do? And Delilah Boone, who had come to this mountain as a stranger, as a joke, as the punchline of every whisper on that train platform, leaned forward and told him exactly what she had in mind. Word about Delilah spread through Cedar Falls the way words spread through small communities, fast, inaccurate, and with extraordinary staying power. By the end of the first month, most of what the town thought it knew about her was wrong. She was not, as had been reported, some desperate cast-off from back east who'd taken a mountain man out of pure necessity. She was not, as Silas Crow had suggested to several people at the saloon, soft, or city-bred, or a liability waiting to happen. What she was, in fact, was becoming apparent to anyone who had actual contact with Black Ridge territory in those weeks. She appeared at a neighboring ranch, the Halverson place, 3 miles west, when their oldest boy came down with a high fever that had the family terrified. She arrived uninvited, knocked once, and when Ruth Halverson answered the door with red eyes and shaking hands, Delilah didn't wait to be asked in. She worked on that boy for 2 days. Fever compress, the yarrow medicine, broth that she stayed to make herself when it became clear Ruth was too exhausted to do it properly. The fever broke on the second night. The boy sat up on the third morning and asked for bread. Ruth Halverson cried on Delilah's shoulder in the doorway. I don't know how to thank you, Ruth said. You'd have done the same, Delilah said, which was generous, because the honest answer was that Ruth hadn't known what to do. Delilah had. The Halverson boy's recovery was not a small thing in a community where a sick child often simply died. People noticed. They also noticed what happened with the McCready fence. The McCready ranch sat on the north slope, and old McCready had been 72 years old and broken in his left hip and had 3 fence sections down after a spring mudslide, which meant his cattle were ranging and his youngest daughter was trying to manage it alone and failing. Delilah showed up with tools and spent a day and a half putting fence back up. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission. She looked at the problem, assessed what was needed, and did it. Old McCready came out on his porch to watch her work, leaning on his stick. And after a while he said, "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said. "You'll owe me information, though, when I need it. You've been on this mountain longer than anyone. I'm going to need to know things." He looked at her for a long time. "Brock Maddox's wife," he said finally, not quite a question. "Delilah Boone Maddox," she said. "Yes." "Heard people calling you things," he said. "People generally do," she replied, driving a post with a clean, efficient stroke. He went back inside. But when she left that afternoon, there was a jar of preserved venison and a smoked fish on the wagon seat. She brought them home and showed Brock. "McCready," he said, surprised. "He doesn't give things away." "He's an old man on a broken hip who's been trying to manage alone and too proud to ask for help," she said. "I just made it easier for him to receive it." Brock put the venison in the cold store. "He'll talk about you," Brock said. "McCready talks to everyone when he gets going." "I know," Delilah said. She was building something in Cedar Falls, one small interaction at a time, the way you build anything that lasts. Not with announcements, but with presence. Not with declarations, but with showing up. Brock watched her do it and said nothing, because some things you recognize as important without being able to fully explain why. And you have the sense to stay out of the way. There was a night in the 5th week when they had a disagreement that was real. Not polite, not managed, but real. The kind that comes when two people who are still strangers in important ways run up against each other's edges. It started over the livestock. Brock had an arrangement with a horse breeder in the valley for the fall season, a trade of labor for 2 additional horses, which he'd been planning to use to expand the working operation. Delilah had looked at the winter stores and the water situation and had concluded, without discussing it with him, that they needed to reduce the herd by 2 animals before the cold season to make the feed calculation work safely. He found out when he came in from the eastern pasture, and she told him what she'd done. "You sold the roan and the gray," he said. "Not a question." "To the Halverson place," she said. "Fair price. Ruth will take good care of them." "Those were my horses," he said. "They were a liability going into winter at our current feed level," she said. "Unless you were planning to buy more grain, I was planning on the trade with Barker. Barker's operation is going under," she said flatly. "He owes Crow money and can't pay it. You don't know this yet, but McCready told me yesterday. By fall, there won't be a Barker ranch to trade with." The silence in the room was the particular silence of someone who has just been told something that makes them simultaneously relieved and frustrated, because the news is good but the method was wrong. "You should have talked to me," Brock said. "You're right," she said. "I should have. I moved too fast." That stopped him. He had braced for argument. That was the shape of this kind of moment, usually. Counter, justify, defend. She just agreed. "It's your ranch," she said. "Even when I'm right about something, you have the right to make the call. I'm sorry I didn't come to you first." He sat down at the table. "How'd you know about Barker?" he said. "I've been talking to people," she said. Quietly. "McCready. Ruth Halverson. The widow Crane at the eastern boundary, who nobody ever thinks to ask about anything because she's a widow, which means she's invisible, which means people say things around her." She sat down across from him. "Crow has been moving on people for 2 years, quietly, drying up their options one by one until selling is the only thing that makes sense. Barker's the latest. You're next." "I've been next for 3 years," Brock said. "He wasn't ready before," she said. "He is now. Something's coming, Brock. I don't know what yet, but he's positioned himself and he's getting ready to move." Brock was quiet for a long time. "You figured all this out in 5 weeks," he said. "I've been paying attention," she said. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had walked off a train platform into a wall of laughter and simply kept walking. Who had shown up on a mountain she'd never seen and immediately started learning it. Who had apologized to him without being pressed and told him a hard truth in the same breath. "What do we do?" he said. Not in the tone of a man asking a woman what she thinks. In the tone of a man who has recognized that the person across from him has been doing the thinking while he was doing the working, and both things are necessary. "We build alliances," she said, "before he moves. The people on this mountain who Crow has been squeezing, McCready, the Halversons, the widow Crane, the Petrescu brothers on the north slope, they're scared of him individually. But together, together they're still scared, Brock said. Together they have someone to be scared with, Delilah said. That's different. Fear shared is fear halved. I learned that a long time ago. He thought about that. You've been building this, he said. Yes, she said, with your name behind it, whether you knew it or not. I should have told you that too. I moved too fast. She folded her hands on the table. I'll stop moving without you. No, he said, and she looked up, surprised. Keep moving. Just tell me where you're going. She studied him for a moment. All right, she said. The fire was low. Outside, something had changed in the wind. It had picked up, was moving through the pines now with more authority, carrying the first edge of cold that meant summer was negotiating its exit. Winter comes early up here, he said. I know, she said. McCready told me. Despite everything, despite the weight of what she'd just told him about Crow, and the coming pressure and the mountain and the isolation that was going to get deeper before it got any easier. Despite all of it, something that had been knotted in Brock Maddox's chest for most of his adult life loosened just slightly, just enough to notice. He wasn't alone on this mountain anymore. Not just the practical sense. Another person in the cabin, another pair of hands on the ranch. But in the actual bone-deep sense. There was someone else here who was paying attention, who was thinking about things, who was carrying a portion of the weight without being asked and without complaint. He had not understood, until this moment, how much that mattered. Delilah, he said. She looked up. He wasn't good at this. He had never been good at this. 11 years alone on a mountain had not made him better at it. Thank you, he said, for coming here. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something genuine and unguarded that he hadn't seen on her before. Thank you for writing back, she said. The wind moved through the pines. The fire burned low. Black Ridge held them both in its dark, cold hands, and neither of them pulled away. The cold arrived in September that year, 3 weeks early and without apology. Brock had been ranching Black Ridge long enough to read the mountain's moods the way other men read calendars and the way the temperature dropped that first week. Not gradually, but in one sudden plunge, as if the mountain had made a decision and acted on it, told him the winter ahead was going to be a hard one. The kind that killed livestock and tested structures and reminded people that the wilderness was not, at its core, interested in their survival. He said as much to Delilah on a Tuesday morning while they were bringing in the last of the hay from the south field. How hard? She asked, pitching a forkful without slowing down. The kind where we won't see the valley floor for 2 months, he said. She was quiet for a moment, working through the implications of that the way she worked through most things, practically, without panic, looking for what needed doing rather than what needed worrying about. Then we have about 3 weeks to get ready, she said. 2.5, if I'm being honest. She pitched another forkful. Then we'd better stop talking. They worked through the afternoon and into the early dark, and Brock found himself noticing, not for the first time, that Delilah worked differently than he'd expected. Not just that she worked hard, he'd known from the letters that she wasn't afraid of labor. It was the quality of her attention. She didn't work mechanically. She was always assessing, always adjusting, always thinking 3 steps ahead of the current task. When she finished stacking one section of the hay, she'd already identified what needed doing next and moved to it without transition. There was no wasted motion, no drama. His previous ranch hand, a young man named Denny who'd lasted 1 winter before deciding he preferred town life, had been full of both. By the time they came in for the evening, they'd finished 2 days of work in 1 afternoon. You've done harvest work before, he said, pulling off his gloves in the doorway. Every fall from the time I was 12, she said. My uncle couldn't afford many hands, so I became one. She said it without self-pity, just fact. The way she reported most things about her past, as information, not as grievance. He'd been learning this about her. She carried a great deal of hard history and wore none of it on her face unless she chose to. Whatever had been done to her in those years before Black Ridge, whatever the accumulated weight of a lifetime of unkindness looked like from the inside, it had not made her brittle. It had made her efficient. It had made her precise. It had made her, he was beginning to understand, very difficult to hurt in the ways that people usually tried to hurt her, because she had already absorbed those particular blows so many times that they had lost their force. What she was not protected against, he suspected, was kindness. That was the thing that could still reach her. He wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge yet, but he held on to it. The next morning, she was already out when he woke. Unusual, because Brock was a before-dawn riser by habit. He found her on the north fence line with a post driver and a pile of new timber, resetting the section they'd discussed weeks before. "You couldn't sleep?" he called. "Slept fine," she said, not looking up. "Just woke up thinking about this fence." He walked over and picked up the other end of the timber she was positioning. They set it together without discussion, fell into the rhythm of the work the way they'd been falling into rhythms all month. Not perfectly, not without the occasional moment of adjustment, but with an increasing ease that came from paying attention to each other. "I went to see the widow Crane yesterday," she said, after they'd set 3 posts. He waited. "She's scared," Delilah said, "more scared than she was a month ago. Crow sent a man out to her property last week. Didn't threaten her directly, just asked questions about her water sources, about her deed, about whether she'd had a lawyer look at her paperwork since her husband died." "That's how he starts?" Brock said. "I know. I told her that. I told her to lock her deed and any paperwork in a tin and give the tin to McCready for safekeeping." Brock looked at her. "She agreed to that?" "She was relieved," Delilah said. "People who are scared mostly just need someone to tell them what to do with the fear. I also told her that if Crow's man comes back, she should send word to us immediately." She positioned the next post. "She's not alone anymore." She needed to know that. Brock thought about Silas Crow's man making the rounds of the isolated properties on the mountain, asking careful questions, mapping vulnerabilities. It was exactly the kind of slow, methodical pressure that Crow specialized in. Nothing you could point to directly, nothing that rose to the level of a complaint, just a steady tightening of the atmosphere until people found selling easier than resisting. "He's going to move before spring," Brock said. It wasn't a question anymore. He'd been thinking about what Delilah had told him, adding it to the 3 years of low-level pressure he'd already absorbed, and the picture had clarified. Crow had been positioning, now he was measuring. "Before winter, I think," Delilah said. Brock looked at her sharply. "That's worse." "That's his advantage," she said. "He moves in winter. People are isolated, can't reach each other, can't compare notes, can't organize. You face him alone in the cold when your resources are already committed to survival." She drove a post with 3 clean strokes. "He's done it before." The Barker situation started in November. The mountain was quiet around them in the way it was quiet in the early morning. Not peaceful, exactly, but watchful, holding its breath before the day began. "How much time do we have?" Brock asked. "I don't know exactly, but I think we need to get the Halversons and McCready and the Petrescu brothers together in one place before the first hard snow. Let them say out loud, in front of each other, what Crow has been doing to each of them separately." She looked at him. "Fear shared is fear halved, but there's a step beyond that. Fear spoken aloud in company becomes something else." "What does it become?" "Anger," she said. "And anger, properly directed, is useful." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about 5 families on a mountain who had been separately squeezed for years, who had each suffered alone because they hadn't known the others were suffering the same way. "I'll ride to the Halverson place this afternoon," he said. She nodded. "Take the shortcut through the ridge trail," she said. "It'll save you an hour." "I've been on this mountain 11 years, he said. "I know the shortcut." "I know you do," she said, without the faintest trace of apology. "I was just saying, despite everything, despite the cold and the threat of Crow and the hard winter bearing down on them from the north, something almost warm moved through his chest. "All right," he said. He took the shortcut. The meeting happened the following Saturday at the Maddox Ranch, on Delilah's instigation and with Brock's weight behind the invitation. She had been right that Brock's name carried things hers didn't yet. The long history of the mountain, the particular authority that came from having survived there longer than most. When the invitation went out under Maddox's name, people came. Old McCready came in his wagon, Hip giving him trouble on the mountain road but not stopping him. Ruth Halverson came with her husband Lars and their oldest, a serious 17-year-old named Jonas, who'd been doing a man's work on the ranch since he was 14. The Petrescu brothers, Emil and Constantine, who had come from somewhere in Eastern Europe 15 years ago and built one of the most solid operations on the North Slope through sheer relentless labor, arrived together on horseback, bringing with them a kind of careful, watchful attention that spoke of men who had survived worse things than Silas Crow in countries where the stakes were higher. The widow Crane did not come. She had sent word that she was afraid to be seen at a gathering, that Crow's man had been watching her property, but she had sent a letter, written in a tight, careful hand, describing everything that had happened in the weeks since Crow's representative had appeared at her door. Delilah read the letter aloud, with the woman's permission, and the silence that followed it in the room was the particular silence of people hearing their own experience described in someone else's words. "That's what he did to me," Lars Halvorsen said quietly when she finished. 2 winters ago. Almost exactly. "And me," Emil Petrescu said. "He sent a man about the water rights on the creek boundary. Just questions. But the questions told me what he was looking for." McCready said nothing, just nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands. They talked for 2 hours. Not organized talk. It wandered, doubled back, got heated in places, went quiet in others. The Petrescu brothers and Lars Halvorsen almost argued about whose situation was worse before Ruth Halvorsen said, with the particular bluntness of a woman who has had enough of men competing over grievances, "It's all bad. Can we talk about what we're going to do about it instead?" Delilah let them talk. She sat at the edge of the room and listened and only spoke twice. Once to ask a clarifying question, once to point out something that connected 2 of the stories in a way that made the overall pattern clear. Both times, people stopped and listened and then kept talking with slightly more direction. Brock watched her manage the room without appearing to manage it. It was something he didn't have a name for, this particular skill she had, the ability to shape a conversation by listening to it. He'd never seen it done that way before. The men he knew who were good in rooms, and there weren't many, managed through presence, volume, the weight of their authority. Delilah managed through attention, and somehow that was more effective. By the end of the evening, they had something loose but real, an agreement to share information, to send word immediately if Crow's men appeared on anyone's property, to not sell or sign anything without first bringing it to the group. It wasn't a legal arrangement. It wasn't formal. But in the particular way of mountain communities, where a man's word in front of witnesses still meant something, it was binding. McCready left last. He paused in the doorway, hat in hand, and looked at Delilah. "You put this together," he said. It wasn't accusation or compliment, just observation, from a man who noticed things. "Brock got everyone here," she said. "Brock's name got everyone here," the old man said. "You kept them here long enough to say what needed saying." He put his hat on. "I've been on this mountain 40 years. You've been here 2 months." He went out. His wagon creaked away into the dark. Delilah stood in the doorway and listened to it go. The cold air came in around her, carrying the smell of coming snow. "He's right," Brock said from behind her. "He's perceptive," she said. "Different thing." "Delilah." She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room, the firelight doing something to his face that made him look less like the unapproachable monument the town thought he was, and more like what he actually was, which was a very large man who had been alone for a very long time and was still, even now, not entirely sure what to do with company. "What we built tonight," he said, "what you built, that matters. Not just for us, for all of them." She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "I know," she said. "That's why I did it." Then she went back inside to bank the fire, because it was cold, and the wood needed managing, and there was always work to do on a mountain that didn't care about the weight of moments. But something had settled between them that night, quiet and real, in the space where formal arrangements end and something genuinely shared begins. The town, for its part, kept talking. Cedar Falls had opinions about Delilah Boone Maddox in the way small towns always have opinions about women who don't fit the shape that's been prepared for them. The Ladies' Auxiliary discussed her at every meeting, which Delilah knew because Ruth Halvorsen attended the meetings and reported back with the particular combination of exhaustion and dark humor that characterized Ruth's approach to most things. "Margaret Tilson says you're an embarrassment to Brock's standing," Ruth told her one afternoon over coffee at the Halvorsen kitchen table. She said a man of his position should have done better for himself. "Margaret Tilson has never been on this mountain in winter," Delilah said, wrapping her hands around her cup. She hasn't, Ruth agreed. She also said... She paused, and something crossed her face that was somewhere between reluctance and suppressed laughter. Say it, Delilah said. She said you work like a ranch hand, which is unbecoming, and you've been seen doing things women shouldn't do, which includes carrying fence posts and driving a wagon unaccompanied and apparently having opinions. Delilah looked at Ruth. Terrible, she said flatly. Ruth lost the battle with her expression and laughed, the kind of real laugh that comes out of the body without permission. Delilah smiled, which was a thing she did carefully and not often. But when she did, it changed her whole face in a way that made her look younger and more open than the composed expression she usually wore. What does Margaret Tilson do in winter? Delilah asked. Organizes the church social and judges other people's curtains, Ruth said. Useful skills, Delilah said. They drank their coffee. The people who matter, Ruth said, after a while more seriously, don't think the way she thinks. You know that. She looked up. Jonas came home from helping at your place last week talking about you for an hour. My 17-year-old boy, who barely speaks at dinner, spent an hour telling me what you said about the soil composition on the east slope and how you were planning to run water. He asked good questions, Delilah said. He never asks me questions, Ruth said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite loneliness, but was adjacent to it. The particular ache of a parent whose child is growing in a direction that exceeds what the parent knows how to support. Send him to help when he's willing, Delilah said. He has a good eye. He'll figure out what he's good at faster if someone lets him try things. Ruth looked at her. You'd do that? We need hands, Delilah said practically. He needs experience. Nobody's doing anyone a favor. But Ruth knew it was more than that, and Delilah knew Ruth knew. And neither of them said so because some things are better left as what they are than as what they're called. Crow's first real move came in October on a Tuesday without warning. Brock was in the upper pasture checking on the cattle when one of the Petrescu brothers rode hard up the trail to find him. Constantin Petrescu rode like a man who didn't waste motion. When Brock saw him coming at that speed, he knew before a word was said that something had happened. The creek, Constantin said, pulling up hard. His English was good, but he lost pieces of it when he was agitated, and right now he was agitated. The upper branch. Something is wrong with the water. They rode down together. The creek that fed the eastern boundary of both the Maddox and Petrescu properties ran clear and cold out of the high country and had been reliable for as long as anyone on the mountain could remember. When they reached the upper branch, the water was running slow and brown, carrying a smell that didn't belong there. Brock dismounted and crouched by the bank. Upstream, he said. They rode another half-mile up to where the creek bent around a granite outcropping, and there found what Crow's men had done in the night. A crude but effective interference with the natural channel, diverting the main flow sideways into a gully that drained nowhere useful, and worse, evidence of something dumped into the water above the diversion. The smell was chemical, sharp underneath the mineral smell of the mountain water. Constantine said something in Romanian that Brock didn't speak but understood the feeling of. When did you notice it? Brock asked. This morning, my cattle would not drink. That was the first sign. Brock stood and looked upstream. The diversion was deliberate and skilled, someone who knew what they were doing. Not a message, not a warning, a functional attack on the water supply, done at night, timed to hit at the beginning of the hard season when replacing a water source would be nearly impossible. He rode hard back to the ranch. Delilah was in the yard splitting wood when he came in. She took one look at his face and set down the axe. He told her, quickly, cleanly, the way she had taught him to tell her things by the example of how she told him things, without softening, just the facts. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a count of 5. He's not waiting for winter, she said. He moved early. Yes. He wants panic, she said. He wants us coming to him before the cold sets in, before we have time to think clearly, because once the snow comes, we're trapped either way, and he'd rather we're trapped without water than trapped with it. We're not going to panic, Brock said. No, she said. We're not, but we're also not going to fix that creek in a day. She looked at him. The Halverson place? Do they still have the deep well? As far as I know. And the McCready Spring, the one on the south face that doesn't freeze until January. Brock understood where she was going. You want to build a water-sharing arrangement. Temporary, she said. Long enough to get through the immediate crisis and give us time to deal with the stream diversion properly. We bring the Petrescu brothers in, offer to share from the ranch's south well in exchange for help clearing and repairing the creek channel. She was already moving, going for her coat. Crow expects each of us to scramble alone. We don't scramble alone. Delilah? He stopped her. She turned. He'll escalate, Brock said. If we respond by organizing instead of panicking, he'll escalate. She looked at him steadily. I know. It could get dangerous. It's already dangerous, she said. It was dangerous the day I got off that train, and you know it. We just didn't have the shape of it yet. He held her gaze. All right, he said. She put on her coat. The timber was in her bearing, the same unbroken quality that had stopped the laughter dead on that train platform in Cedar Falls, the quality that made people pause before deciding whether to underestimate her, and then usually underestimate her anyway, because they couldn't imagine that a woman who looked the way she looked could carry the kind of interior architecture she was carrying. Their loss, every time. She was already calling to Jonas Halverson, who had been working in the barn, and came out now at the sound of her voice. Saddle up, she said. I need you to ride to your father. He was saddled and gone in 4 minutes. Brock watched the boy ride out through the gate and thought about Silas Crow sitting in his warm office in Cedar Falls, turning his silver watch chain in his fingers, believing he had just made his decisive move. He thought about Delilah walking toward him on that train platform, chin up, no apology, straight through a wall of other people's contempt. He almost felt sorry for Crow. Almost. The creek diversion took 11 days to fix. 11 days of cold work in water that numbed hands past feeling, clearing the interference Crow's men had built, rerouting the channel back to its natural course, and dealing with the contamination question, which turned out to be less severe than the smell had suggested. Someone had dumped a barrel of something foul-tasting but not lethal, enough to make the cattle refuse the water, but not enough to poison the ground permanently. Emil Petrescu, who had some chemistry knowledge from his years in Europe, confirmed it after 2 days of careful observation. The creek would run clean again once the flow was fully restored. That was the good news. The bad news was that the work cost them time and labor they couldn't spare, and it announced something to everyone on the mountain who was paying attention. Silas Crow had stopped circling. Brock knew it. The Petrescu brothers knew it. McCready, when he heard, went quiet in the way that old men go quiet, when something they've been afraid of for years finally arrives, and they find they're no more prepared for it than they feared they'd be. Delilah was the one who said it plainly, standing at the creek bank on the 11th day with mud on her coat and her hair coming out of its braid, and her hands wrapped in cloth to keep the cold from finishing what the water had started. He's watching us right now, she said. Or someone reporting to him is. He wants to know if this slowed us down. Did it? Emil asked. She wrung the cloth from her hands and looked at the creek, running clear again, moving properly between its banks. Yes, she said. It cost us 11 days. Let's not pretend otherwise. She looked at Brock. What else is he going to come for? The eastern pasture access, Brock said immediately. He'd been thinking about it for days. There's a section of trail between our land and the Halverson boundary that technically runs through a strip Crow bought 3 years ago from a failed homesteader. He's never moved on it, but he's held it. He can block it? If he plants a gate and locks it, yeah. Does it legally too, which is the worst kind. Delilah turned that over. How much would it cost us if that trail is closed? Every supply run adds 2 hours. In winter, that's the difference between making it back before dark and not making it back. She was quiet for a moment. Then, we need to establish a secondary route before he moves on the trail. There isn't one, Brock said. Not a wagon-worthy one. Then we make one, she said. He started to explain why that wasn't realistic. The terrain, the time, the approaching winter. And then stopped, because she was looking at him with that particular expression she had when she'd already done the calculation and was waiting for him to catch up. Where? He said. The north shoulder. McCready showed me the old survey line last week. There was a track there 40 years ago, before a rockfall covered part of it. The rockfall's manageable, maybe 3 days of work to clear a wagon path. 3 days we don't have, Brock said. We have them now, she said. We won't have them in January. She was right. She was usually right about the timing of things, which he'd stopped finding annoying and started finding useful. He didn't always agree with her. There had been 4 or 5 real disagreements in the months since she'd arrived, genuine friction about how to do things, and twice she'd been wrong and acknowledged it, and twice he'd been wrong and had to acknowledge it, and once they'd both been wrong in different directions, and the solution had been something neither of them had thought of initially. But on the question of timing, on the question of when to move and when to wait, she had a sense that he'd stopped second-guessing. They started on the North Shoulder track the next morning. It was also in those weeks that Delilah told him about the pregnancy. She told him on a Thursday evening, matter-of-factly, while she was writing in her journal and he was cleaning a rifle by the fire. Not dramatically, not building to it. She just looked up and said, "I'm pregnant. Probably 4 months along, from my calculation." He set the rifle down. He looked at her. She was watching him with the careful, neutral expression she kept for moments, when she wasn't sure how something would land. Not exactly braced, but aware, taking in information. 4 months, he said. Approximately. I wasn't certain until recently. The signs were there earlier, but I wanted to be sure before I said anything. He thought about the last 4 months, the creek diversion, the 11 days of cold work, the North Shoulder trail they'd started 2 days ago, the fence repairs, the supply runs. You've been doing all of that. Women have been working through pregnancies since before anyone was writing things down, she said. I know my limits. Delilah, I'm not fragile, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite sharp, but had an edge. I need you to hear that. I'm pregnant, not broken. He was quiet. The truth was that fear had moved into him so fast and so completely that he hadn't had time to name it before it was already there. Fear with a specific shape, detailed and cold. Because he'd seen what Black Ridge winters did, and now there was more at stake than land and water and the grinding pressure of Silas Crow. Now there was this. I'm scared, he said. He said it plainly because Delilah had a low tolerance for things that were true being said as though they weren't. She softened slightly. Not completely, but the edge went out of her voice. I know, she said. So am I. A little. A little, he said. All right, more than a little. She closed her journal, but scared or not, the situation is what it is. We're going to need to think about the nearest doctor, which is Cedar Falls, which is 2 hours in good weather. And we're going to need to think about the timing relative to winter, and we're going to need to be practical about it. The timing, he said slowly. February, she said. Roughly. February. The deepest point of a Black Ridge winter. The month when the snow came highest and the trails became impassable, and the world reduced itself to whatever was inside the cabin walls and whatever was within walking distance. He picked the rifle back up. Put it down again. This was a thing he did when he was thinking through something difficult, reached for something familiar, and then abandoned it because the familiar thing wasn't actually useful. We'll get you to Cedar Falls before the hard snow, he said. You can stay with... I'm not leaving the ranch, she said. He looked up. Brock. Her voice was patient but definite. I am not going to Cedar Falls. I am not going to spend the winter in some boarding house in a town that has spent the last 4 months making jokes at my expense, away from everything I've been building here, waiting for a baby while Crow does whatever he's going to do to our property while we're separated and can't respond. She looked at him steadily. I will have this baby on this mountain in this house, with your help. We will manage. The fire popped. He thought about arguing. He had several good arguments. Proximity to medical care, the physical demands of late pregnancy, the genuine possibility that something could go wrong in ways that the Yarrow medicine and the medical books in her crate could not address. They were real arguments, and he believed in them. He also knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that arguing would accomplish nothing. Not because she was stubborn, though she was, in the specific way of people who have survived a great deal by holding their position, but because she wasn't wrong. Cedar Falls was 2 hours away in good weather. In a February storm, it might as well be on the other side of the continent. Then we need to make sure we're ready, he said. Yes, she said. We do. That was the end of the discussion, which was characteristic of how they had both learned to handle the things they disagreed about, not by resolving them cleanly, because some things don't resolve cleanly, but by finding the point past the disagreement where both of them could work. The North Shoulder track got finished in 4 days, not 3. The rockfall was worse than the old survey had suggested, and Constantin Petrescu, who helped on days 2 and 3, took a rock off his knee on day 3 that laid him up for a week. But the track was passable by wagon when it was done. And when Crow sent a man to padlock the eastern trail gate 10 days later, Brock simply smiled, which was something he didn't do often enough that it startled the man slightly. The man went back to Crow with that report. Crow's response came the following week in the form of a letter delivered through the Cedar Falls post office. Written in the careful language of someone who employs lawyers, it concerned a disputed property boundary on the south-facing slope above the ranch, a survey question from the original land grant that had apparently never been formally resolved, and it suggested that Brock might want to consult his paperwork carefully before making any further improvements to the relevant sections. Delilah read the letter twice and then read it aloud to Brock. "He's creating uncertainty," she said. "If there's a question about the boundary, he can tie things up legally. It doesn't matter if he wins. It matters that the fight costs us time and money we don't have." "My deed is solid," Brock said. "Do you have a lawyer?" Silence. "There's an attorney in Cedar Falls." "Crow's attorney," Delilah said. More silence. "There's a judge that rides the circuit," Brock said. "When does he come through?" "March, usually." "After winter," Delilah said. "After whatever Crow is planning." She folded the letter. "I'm going to write to Denver. There's a land rights organization. I read about it in a newspaper from 2 years back. They handle exactly this kind of manufactured dispute. I don't know if they'll respond in time, but I'd rather have something in motion than nothing." She was already moving to her writing desk. Brock watched her settle into the chair, pull a sheet of paper, uncap the ink. Her writing was quick and dense, and she barely paused. This was a woman who had been composing arguments in her head long before she sat down to write them, which was another thing he'd learned about her. "What made you think about a land rights organization?" he asked. "I read a lot," she said without looking up. "Back east, when the town had written me off as useless, I had a great deal of time to read. Books, newspapers, anything I could get. I stored things up." A pause, the scratch of pen. "Funny how the things people assumed were wasted years turn out to be the ones that actually prepared you." He sat with that. He thought about his own years on Black Ridge, the isolation, the solitude, the way he'd built the walls of his life thicker every winter until he was encased in something that kept the cold out and everything else out along with it. Those years hadn't felt wasted, but they hadn't felt like preparation either. They'd felt like survival, and survival had been enough. Until it wasn't. "Delilah," he said. "I'm glad you came." She stopped writing. The silence had a different quality than the silences they usually shared. She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders shift. Not exactly a reaction, but something. A small, involuntary acknowledgement that the words had reached somewhere real. "Don't get sentimental on me now," she said. "I need to finish this letter." But her voice had something in it. He left her to write. November came in like it meant business, and December followed without mercy. The snow arrived properly in the second week of November and didn't stop. Not constantly, not a single unbroken storm, but relentlessly. A few days of heavy snowfall, a brief pause, another 3 days of snow, another pause. The pattern of a mountain winter that intends to stay. The cold settled in below 20 degrees and mostly stayed there. The ranch contracted around them. The daily range of movement reduced to what was necessary: livestock, firewood, the essential maintenance that kept the structures from failing under the weight of weather. The world outside the property became theoretical. Cedar Falls might as well have been a story someone told about a place they'd once visited. This was the thing about Black Ridge winters that Brock had tried to explain in his letters, and that Delilah had apparently understood better from the reading than most people understood from being told. It wasn't the cold that got to people. It was the smallness, the reduction of everything to a tiny circle of warmth inside an enormous dark. Delilah handled it differently than he'd expected, which by this point should have stopped surprising him, but somehow still did. She didn't go restless or despairing the way some people went. She went inward, into a kind of productive stillness, reading, writing in her journal, working on the small repairs and preparations that couldn't be done in the summer heat, learning things. She had discovered in the trunk of supplies she'd ordered through the Cedar Falls merchant before the snow closed the trails 3 new medical texts that she read with the focused attention she gave to everything that she decided mattered. She also talked to him. Really talked. Not the practical exchange of necessary information that passed for conversation in their early months, but actual conversation, the kind that went somewhere unexpected. He was not naturally a talker. He'd lived alone long enough that words had come to feel like currency to be spent carefully. But she had a way of asking questions that made silence seem like the wrong choice. Not through pressure, but through genuine interest, the kind that makes a person feel that what they say actually matters to the listener. "What was the worst winter you had up here?" she asked one evening. He thought about it honestly. "The year I was 33, he said. "The snow came in October and didn't fully clear until May. I lost half the cattle and 2 of the horses. I went 41 days without seeing another person." "How'd that feel?" "Bad," he said. "But I didn't understand how bad until it was over. When you're in it, you just manage. You find out what you're made of later, when you have the space to think about it." She was quiet for a moment, knitting something. She'd taken up knitting in November, a practical response to the coming baby and the limited options for occupation in a snowbound cabin. "I had a winter like that," she said. "Not cold, but similar. After my uncle died, I was 24. The farm had to be settled, and I had no money and nowhere particular to go. I spent 4 months in a boarding house in a town where I didn't know anyone, working kitchen shifts for the room and board, not really seeing a way forward." "What changed?" "I stopped waiting for something to change," she said. "That's what changed. I stopped waiting for someone to come along with an answer and started building my own answer. It was slow, and it wasn't pretty, and I made a lot of mistakes." She looked up. "But it was mine." The fire, the knitting, the cabin holding against the weight of snow. "The letters," he said, "to the agency. That was your answer." "Part of it," she said. "The letters were, I'd tried other things before, tried to make a life in 3 different towns." A pause. "Towns that made clear, in various ways, that a woman who looked the way I looked wasn't wanted." She said it without bitterness, just plainly. "Blackridge wasn't my first choice. It was my honest choice. When I read your description of the place, the isolation, the hard winters, the fact that you warned me 3 times, I thought, that's a place that doesn't have time for pretending. That's a place where what you can do matters more than what you look like." He looked at her. "Were you right?" he asked. She considered it, needles moving steadily. "Mostly," she said. "Cedar Falls has time for pretending, but the mountain itself, yes, the mountain doesn't care." They sat with that. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with the low, constant sound that Brock had stopped noticing years ago and had recently started hearing again, as if her presence had cleaned something from his ears. January arrived and Delilah's body rounded fully into the late stage of pregnancy, and Brock found himself quietly rearranging his mental map of the ranch around her, not hovering, which she had made clear early she would not tolerate, but aware. Carrying the heavier things without being asked. Positioning tasks differently. Keeping a sharper eye on the weather. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You're managing me," she said one morning. "I'm being practical," he said. "You rearranged the firewood so I don't have to reach for it." The way it was stacked was inefficient. She looked at him. He looked at the firewood. "Thank you," she said. "Just don't make a whole thing of it." "Wasn't planning to," he said. Then came the night in the 2nd week of February. Brock had been watching the sky for 2 days. There was a particular color that Blackridge sky turned before the worst storms. Not gray exactly, but a kind of bruised yellow gray, like something enormous had been hit and the wound was showing through the clouds. He'd seen it only 4 times in 11 years, and each time the storm that followed had been bad enough to remember. On the evening of the 14th, the sky turned that color. He brought in 3 extra loads of firewood and stacked them just inside the cabin door. He checked the livestock twice, brought the 2 youngest animals inside the barn's inner room where the temperature held better. He filled every water container they had. Delilah watched him do all of this without comment, which was unusual, and when he came in from the last firewood run and found her standing at the window looking at the sky, he knew she'd read it the same way he had. "Tonight?" she said. "Maybe. Tomorrow for certain." She nodded slowly. Then she put her hand on the window frame for a brief moment. Not for balance, just a pause, a gathering of something. "Brock," she said. He stopped shaking snow from his coat. "I think the baby's coming." The storm hit at midnight, the same hour the labor began in earnest. There was something almost insulting about the timing. The mountain delivering its worst weather at the precise moment when they needed everything to be still and manageable, as if Black Ridge had a particular interest in testing them on the hardest possible terms. The wind came first, hard enough that the cabin walls shuddered in a way they hadn't shuddered all winter. Then the snow came sideways, visible even in the darkness, a white wall that reduced the world outside to nothing at all. Inside, Brock built the fire as high as it would go and stayed. He was not a man with medical training. What he had was the instructions from Delilah's books, which she had made him read twice in January with the particular matter-of-factness of someone who plans for bad scenarios because ignoring them doesn't make them less likely. What he had was her voice, which stayed steady through the first hours in a way that he drew from like water from a well. What he had was whatever 11 years on a mountain that killed careless people had deposited in him, a specific kind of calm that came not from confidence but from the understanding that panic was a luxury and that the task in front of him was the only thing that existed. He worked through the night. It was 6 hours before the baby came, 6 hours during which the storm dismantled everything outside. He could hear things going in the wind, branches, something structural from the direction of the barn that he filed away as a future problem and refused to think about now. 6 hours during which Delilah's control, which he'd thought was the most formidable thing he'd ever encountered, showed its limits and showed its depth both. She was not composed through all of it. There was real pain and real fear, and she made sounds that he would remember for the rest of his life. But she never completely lost herself, never stopped being the person in that room who knew the most about what was happening and what needed doing. She told him what to do. He did it. The baby arrived just before 5 in the morning. It arrived silent and the color of deep water, and Brock held it in his hands and thought, with a cold that had nothing to do with the storm, that this small, still thing was gone before it had begun. Then it cried. One sound, thin and furious, from something that had no business having that much will in such a small body. Delilah made a sound that he had no category for. Not a word, not quite a sob, something that came from a place below language. "Give her to me," she said. He placed the baby against Delilah's chest. The crying continued, strengthening, becoming more certain of itself. "Clara," Delilah said. Her voice was wrecked from the night. "Her name is Clara." Brock was sitting on the edge of the bed with his back against the wall and his hand shaking, not from cold. The room was genuinely warm, but from something that had nowhere else to go. He looked at Delilah and the baby and the fire throwing its unsteady light across them both. He had 11 years of solitude behind him, 11 years of a life built for one, in a place that had seemed to confirm every winter that he was meant to be alone on this mountain because alone was the only thing that made sense for a man like him. He looked at his daughter's face, red and furious and alive. He looked at his wife, exhausted and tear-streaked and holding the baby with both arms, like the mountain itself would have to come through her to take it. He had been wrong about being meant for solitude. He'd only thought it for so long because he hadn't had evidence to the contrary. He had evidence now. Outside, the storm kept going. It had no interest in this moment, no sense of occasion, no softening for the sake of what had just happened inside this cabin. The wind was still taking pieces of the world apart, and the snow was still building its walls in every direction. Inside, the fire held. Inside, Clara Maddox cried her way into existence with the particular determination of someone who had already decided that whatever this world was, she was in it. Inside, that was enough. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke on the morning of the 17th, the world outside the cabin had been rearranged. The barn's east-facing wall had partially collapsed under the snow load. That had been the structural sound Brock heard on the first night, the one he'd filed away as a future problem. The north fence line was buried under 4 feet of drift. The trail down to Cedar Falls was gone entirely, just a continuous white slope where the switchbacks used to be. Brock stood in the doorway, looking at all of it in the flat gray light of post-storm morning, and made a list in his head of what needed doing first, second, and third. Behind him, from the bedroom, Clara cried. He turned around. Delilah was already awake. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the birth, which was 5 days ago now, and it was beginning to show in her face, in the particular hollowness around her eyes that meant the body is running on something other than rest. She was sitting up with the baby, managing the feeding with the same focused competence she applied to everything, but he could see the effort in her shoulders. "The barn wall's down," he said from the doorway. "How bad?" "East side, partial. The structure's holding, but I need to shore it up before the next snow, or it comes down the rest of the way." "The cattle?" "I'll check now." "Brock." She looked up. "Eat something first. You haven't eaten properly in 3 days either." He started to say he was fine and stopped, because she was looking at him with that expression that meant she already knew what he was about to say and had already assessed its accuracy and found it wanting. He ate first. The cattle were alive. 2 of the older animals were stressed from the cold but intact, and the horses had made it through in the inner stall exactly as planned. The barn wall was a real problem, but a manageable one. 3 days of work, maybe 4, with the right timber, and they had timber stockpiled under the equipment overhang precisely because Delilah had insisted on it in October when he'd thought they had enough. He spent the morning on the barn and came in at midday to find Delilah up and moving, Clara strapped against her chest in a length of cloth she'd fashioned and tied in a configuration that he didn't know the name of but that left her hands free. "You should be resting," he said. "I've been resting for 5 days," she said. "I'm going insane." "You gave birth 5 days ago." "Days." "I know when I gave birth," she said. "I was there." She was stirring something on the stove, moving with more care than usual, but moving. "The letter I sent to Denver before the snow. I need to send a follow-up, when the trail is clear enough for a rider." He looked at her. "You're thinking about Crow," he said. "I've been thinking about Crow since approximately hour 3 of the labor," she said. "Turns out your mind goes interesting places when you're in that much pain. I had a very clear thought around 4 in the morning that if Silas Crow tries to move on this property while I have a 5-day-old baby, I'm going to become his single largest problem." He almost smiled. She looked over her shoulder at him. "I'm not joking," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why it's—" He stopped. "Funny?" she offered. "Not the word I was going to use," he said. "I was going to say something else." "What?" He poured himself coffee. "Comforting," he said finally. She turned back to the stove, but he saw the shift in her shoulders. That small, involuntary thing she did when something landed somewhere real. The trails cleared enough for riding by the end of February, and the first rider to use the North Shoulder track was Jonas Halverson, who came up from the valley with his jaw set and his eyes carrying something that Brock recognized immediately as news that had been sitting in the boy's chest for days, waiting for the snow to allow its delivery. He pulled up in the yard and didn't dismount. "Mr. Maddox," he said, "Crow burned the Petrescu barn." Brock went still. "When?" 4 nights ago, in the storm. Emil says it was deliberate. The fire started in 3 places. Konstantin's oldest horse died in it. Jonas's voice stayed controlled, but his hands on the reins were tight. They lost everything stored inside. All their winter grain, their tools, 2 of the milk cattle. Brock turned and went inside. Delilah was at the table feeding Clara when he came in. She read him in one look. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She was quiet for a count of 10. Clara made small sounds against her, unaware of anything except the immediate warmth of her mother's body. "He moved in the storm," Delilah said. "On purpose. Isolate them first, then burn. And he knew no one could come to help or even know about it for days." Her voice was level, but something under it had gone hard in a way he recognized. The particular quality of a person who has been patient with something for a long time and has arrived at the end of that patience. He's not squeezing anymore. He's burning. "I need to go to the Petrescu place," Brock said. "We need to go," she said. "Delilah. Clara is 11 days old, and Ruth Halverson can take her for a few hours." She looked at him directly. "I need to be there. The Petrescus need to see that we're both there. It means something different than just you going." He thought about arguing. He thought about what it would mean to Emil and Konstantin Petrescu, who had lost their barn and their grain and one of their horses in a fire set by a man who knew they were isolated and alone. To look up and see Brock Maddox coming, yes, but also Delilah, who had shown up at their kitchen table in October and spoken plainly about what Crow was doing, who had organized the meeting that made them feel less alone for the first time in 2 years. "All right," he said. Ruth took Clara without question. She held the baby with the automatic ease of a woman who had raised 3 of her own and looked at Delilah and said, "You go. She'll be here when you get back." Delilah kissed the top of Clara's head, a quick, fierce press of her lips, and turned and walked to the wagon without looking back, because looking back was the kind of thing that made leaving harder, and she had things to do. The Petrescu place looked like grief. The barn was a collapsed black outline against the snow, still carrying the faint smell of old smoke even in the cold. Constantine was moving through the debris with a systematic numbness that Brock recognized, the mechanical activity of a man who cannot afford to stop moving because stopping would mean feeling the full weight of what had been taken. Emil was sitting on the porch steps with his hands between his knees, staring at the wreckage. He looked up when the wagon came into the yard. Brock climbed down. Then Delilah climbed down, slower but steady, and walked across the yard to where Emil was sitting and sat down on the step beside him without saying anything. Just sat there. Emil looked at her. "He's going to keep going," Emil said. His voice was rough. "Until we sell or until we have nothing left to sell." "Yes," Delilah said. "That's his plan. Then what do we do?" He said it with the exhaustion of a man who has been asking himself that question in the dark for 4 nights. "What do we do that he doesn't burn down?" "We stop being separate targets," she said. "What he's been doing works because he hits us one at a time. The creek was us. The trail gate was us. This," she looked at the ruined barn, "is you. Separate. So each time we respond separately, we recover separately, we're weaker after it than before." Emil waited. "He can burn a barn," Delilah said. "He can't burn the whole mountain at once." Constantine had stopped working through the debris and was standing at the edge of it, listening. "You want us to go to the law," Emil said. It wasn't quite hope. It was the tone of a man who has considered something and found reasons to doubt it. "The circuit judge gets here in March," Delilah said. "That's 3 weeks. In the meantime, I want every family on this mountain, every family that Crow has pressured, threatened, or damaged, to put what happened to them in writing. Dates, details, descriptions, signed, witnessed by at least one other person." She looked at Emil. "A burned barn with 3 separate origin points, documented, witnessed, dated, is not the same as one man's word against another. It's evidence, and evidence added to evidence from 6 different families over 2 years. That's a pattern that a federal marshal finds interesting even if a local judge doesn't." Silence. The cold sat around them, the black outline of the barn against the white snow. "You think the marshal will come?" Constantine asked. "I think if I send a complete enough letter to Denver with enough documented incidents, yes," Delilah said. "I've already sent one. I need more to add to it." Emil looked at her for a long time with the careful assessment of a man who had learned through hard experience in 2 countries to measure people by what they were actually made of rather than what they presented. "You've been building this since you got here," he said. "Since before I got here," she said. "Since I understood what kind of place this was and what kind of man Crow is." She paused. "I came to this mountain with nothing that Cedar Falls wanted. I spent the first month being the joke everyone told in the saloon, but I've been paying attention since the day I arrived, and what I know now, written down properly and sent to the right people, is going to matter." Emil looked at Brock. Brock said, "She's not wrong." Emil almost laughed. It came out broken and short, more breath than sound, but it was real. "All right," he said, "tell me what to write." What followed in March was the quietest kind of war, the kind fought with ink and paper, and the careful recollection of dates and damages. Delilah moved between the mountain families like a circuit rider herself, sitting at kitchen tables with a notebook, asking questions, transcribing, shaping the raw material of 2 years of fear and loss into a document that had structure and weight. The widow Crane's testimony alone ran to 4 pages. The woman who had been invisible, who people said things around because they decided she wasn't really there, turned out to have a memory like a courthouse ledger. She had dates. She had names of Crow's men. She had a description of a conversation she'd overheard in the Cedar Falls Mercantile between Crow and his attorney that was, Delilah told Brock when she came home that evening, exactly the kind of thing that federal investigators found useful. "She's been watching all of this for 2 years, Delilah said, setting her notes on the table. Watching and remembering and telling herself it didn't matter because nobody would listen to her. "But you listened," Brock said. I always listen to people who've been told they're not worth listening to, she said. They tend to know a great deal. The circuit judge arrived in the third week of March, and Delilah was in his office in Cedar Falls within 4 hours of his arrival. She brought 47 pages of documented testimony, 3 signed affidavits from families who had been too afraid to speak individually but were willing to put their names on a collective account, and a letter from the Denver Land Rights Organization confirming they were prepared to send a representative. The judge, a lean, tired man named Calloway, who had seen a great deal of frontier maneuvering in his 20 years on the circuit, read for 2 hours while Delilah sat in the chair across from his desk and waited. He looked up. "Mrs. Maddox," he said, "this is a substantial document." "Yes," she said. "You compiled this yourself." With the cooperation of the families involved, he looked back at the pages. The creek diversion alone is documented with witnesses and a description from Emil Petrescu, who has chemistry background of the substance used, she said. The barn fire has 3 independent witness statements placing 2 of Crow's hired men in the vicinity the night before the fire, despite the blizzard conditions. Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Crow has friends in this territory," he said. "Not as a threat, as a fact." "I know," Delilah said. "Crow has friends everywhere he owes money, and everywhere people owe him money, which is most of Cedar Falls. But friends aren't the same as innocence, and documentation isn't the same as rumor." She looked at him steadily. "I'm asking you to forward this to a federal marshal. I'm not asking you to rule on anything today. I'm asking you to make sure the right people see this." He studied her. "You're not from here originally," he said. "No. How long have you been on Black Ridge?" 8 months, she said. He looked back at the 47 pages. 8 months, he said quietly, to himself more than to her. He forwarded the documentation that afternoon. What Crow didn't know, what he couldn't have calculated from inside his comfortable office with his silver watch chain and his sense of the territory as a place he'd already won, was that the federal marshal for the Northern District had already received 1 letter from Delilah 3 months prior and had flagged the name Silas Crow in his own records based on complaints from 2 other territories where similar patterns had emerged under similar names. The 47 pages from Judge Calloway didn't start an investigation. They completed one that had already been quietly building. The marshal arrived in Cedar Falls in April. He arrived without announcement, which was how marshals arrived when they intended to actually find things rather than give warning. He spent a week asking questions in a town that was accustomed to Crow's influence and was therefore accustomed to answering questions carefully. But he was patient and thorough, and he had Delilah's documentation as a map, which meant he knew which questions to ask and didn't need people to volunteer information they were afraid to volunteer. On a Thursday morning in the second week of April, 2 of Crow's hired men were arrested at the boarding house where they had been living since the winter. On Friday, a federal warrant was issued for Silas Crow on charges of property destruction, water rights interference, and a 3rd charge relating to the fraudulent survey dispute he'd manufactured in the fall. Crow was arrested in his own office, between his desk and his window, with its view of the valley he'd spent 20 years assembling. Brock heard about it from Jonas Halverson, who rode up the trail so fast his horse was still blowing hard when he pulled up in the yard. "They took him," Jonas said. "This morning. My father saw it. 2 federal men walked right into his office and put him in irons." Brock stood in the yard for a moment. Then he went inside. Delilah was at the table, nursing Clara, reading one of her medical texts with the book propped against a jar of preserves. She looked up at his face. "They got him," she said. Not a question. "This morning," he said. She looked back at the book for a moment. Then she closed it, which she did carefully because she treated books the way she treated useful tools, with respect for the function. "Good," she said. That was all she said. No triumph in her voice, no particular satisfaction, just the tone of someone who had set out to accomplish something specific and had confirmed that it was accomplished. It occurred to Brock, watching her close that book, that this was what the absence of ego looked like in action. She hadn't done any of this to be right, or to win, or to prove something to Cedar Falls. She'd done it because the mountain needed it done, and she was the person who knew how to do it. Clara made a small sound. Delilah adjusted her hold and looked up at Brock. "The east pasture fence is still buried," she said. "Once the ground thaws enough to reset posts, we should—" "Delilah," he said. She looked at him. He crossed the room and sat down at the table across from her, which was where he sat when he had something to say that mattered and wanted to be at the same level when he said it. What you did, he said, all of it. The meetings, the documentation, the widow Crane, the judge, all of it. He stopped and put his hands flat on the table, which was something he did when he was trying to anchor himself to saying a thing rather than leaving it unsaid. I couldn't have done any of that. You would have figured something out, she said. No, he said. I would have dug in and fought him with my hands and lost eventually because that's how he wanted it. He wanted me angry and isolated and responding on his terms. He looked at her. You changed the terms. She was quiet for a moment. We changed them, she said. Your name opened doors I couldn't have opened alone. Your relationships on this mountain, McCready, the Petrescues, those were yours. I just used what was already here. That's not Brock. Her voice was gentle but firm. We did it together. That's not me being modest. That's just what happened. He sat with that. Outside, the April air was doing something for the first time in months, warming, thawing, beginning the slow work of returning the world to its summer version. The snow was still present but retreating. The creek was running clear and loud below the eastern property line, doing the thing water always does when you've worked to restore it. Clara had fallen asleep against Delilah's chest. Brock looked at his daughter's face, slack and peaceful and entirely unaware of everything that had been fought over on this mountain in the 8 months since her parents had arrived at different ends of a train platform and walked toward each other through a wall of other people's laughter. He thought about the man he'd been before Delilah arrived. Not a bad man, but a finished one. A man who had concluded, somewhere in his years of solitude, that his life was a settled question, that the shape of it was determined, that the mountain was his, and the isolation was his, and there was nothing more to add. He had been wrong about that in every direction. When spring fully comes, he said, I want to rebuild the Petrescu barn. I want us, all the families together, to rebuild it. So it's done right and done fast. And so the Petrescues know that what Crow burned was not the end of something, but the before of something. Delilah looked at him. That's a good idea, she said. I have them occasionally, he said. And there it was. Something that had been building in the corners of their conversations for months. Something careful and understated and therefore completely genuine. She smiled and he almost smiled back. And between those two nearly expressions was more warmth than most people managed with declarations. Clara slept on, indifferent to all of it. The mountain held them in its April light, cold still but changing, the way mountains change. Not gracefully, not quickly, but with the inevitability of something that has made up its mind. They built the Petrescu barn in May, when the ground had thawed enough to sink new posts and the air had lost its killing edge. It took 4 days. Every family on the mountain came. The Halversons, McCready with his bad hip and his refusal to sit out, the widow Crane who showed up the first morning with a wagon full of lumber she'd bought in Cedar Falls and hadn't told anyone she was bringing. Even 2 families from the lower valley who had no direct stake in the Petrescu situation came, because word had moved through the territory the way word moves when something significant has happened and people want to be present for what comes after. Emil and Constantine Petrescu stood in their yard on that first morning and watched the wagons come in, and neither of them spoke for a long time. I don't know how to accept this, Emil said quietly to Delilah, who was standing beside him. You don't have to accept it, she said. Just let it happen. People need to do this as much as you need to receive it. Don't take that away from them. He looked at her. Where did you learn that? He said. She thought about it honestly. From years of nobody doing it for me, she said. I figured out what it would have meant, so I try to give it when I can. He nodded slowly and went to greet the wagons. The barn went up rough but solid, the kind of structure that showed, in every beam and nail, the marks of many different hands working from slightly different habits and angles, and was stronger for it. Not beautiful. Functional in the deep sense of a thing built by people who understood what it needed to survive. By the 4th day, the roof was on and the doors were hung, and Constantine brought out a bottle of something he'd been saving since Europe. Something dark in a clay bottle that he said had no direct English translation in terms of name, but which, he said, his grandmother had made in a country none of them would ever see, and which was meant for moments exactly like this one. They drank it in small amounts, It tasted like wood smoke in winter and something that had no category. McCready made a face when he swallowed. "That's the worst thing I've ever tasted," he said to Constantine. "Yes," Constantine agreed, refilling his cup. Delilah was sitting on the new lumber of the barn's threshold with Clara in her lap. 3 months old now, and alert in the way of babies who are taking in everything at once, watching the faces of the people around her with an expression of profound concentration. Ruth Halverson sat beside her, and Jonas sat on the other side of his mother, and Lars stood behind them, and the configuration of it looked like nothing so much as a family portrait. Not biological family, but the other kind, the kind you build out of proximity and shared difficulty, and the particular bond of people who have been through something together. Brock stood at the edge of it all, watching. He watched Delilah pass Clara to Ruth and stand up and say something to Emil that made him nod seriously. He watched her cross the yard to where the widow Crane was sitting alone near her wagon, still slightly apart from the group the way people who have been alone for a long time remain slightly apart even when they've been welcomed, and sit down beside her and draw her into conversation. He watched the widow Crane's shoulders, which had been held up near her ears for most of the day, come down by about an inch. Brock had a thought standing there that he wouldn't have known how to have a year ago, before Delilah arrived, because a year ago he hadn't had the vocabulary for it. The thought was this: strength is not the same as size. He had spent his whole life being the largest person in every room he entered and the most feared, and he had confused that with being strong in any way that actually mattered. What Delilah did, what she had been doing since the day she stepped off that train, was strength of a different order entirely. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up where it's needed and does what needs doing and doesn't require anyone's applause to keep functioning. He had confused endurance with strength his whole life. He understood the difference now. She caught him watching her from across the yard. She raised an eyebrow in that particular way she had. He looked away, but not before she saw the expression on his face, which he had stopped trying to manage around her months ago, because she read him too well for managing to accomplish anything. Silas Crow's trial was held in Cedar Falls in June, in a courtroom that was full in a way courtrooms in small territories rarely were. People came from across the mountain and the valley, which said something about how much had been held down for how long, and how much people needed to see it formally named. Brock and Delilah sat together in the second row. Clara was with Ruth. Crow entered looking less diminished than Brock had expected. Still, the same press suit, the same quality of a man who considers himself the center of whatever room he's in. He looked at Brock when he entered, looked at Delilah. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite recognition, wasn't quite respect, but was something adjacent to the moment when a person understands that they have misjudged something in a way that cannot be corrected. Delilah looked back at him without expression. Crow looked away first. The testimony took 2 days. The widow Crane spoke for 40 minutes in a voice that was quiet but never wavered, laying out 2 years of documented observation with the precision of someone who had been preparing this testimony in their head for a long time without knowing when they'd have the chance to deliver it. Emil Petrescu described the barn fire with a specificity that made the courtroom very still. 3 families from the lower valley testified to separate incidents that fit the same pattern. Delilah was called on the second day. She took the witness stand in a room full of people who had spent the better part of a year forming opinions about her, and she gave her testimony in the same direct, composed voice she used for everything. Not performing composure, just being it, because she had nothing to hide and had learned long ago that the clearest thing you can do in a room that wants to diminish you is to be exactly as large as you actually are. She was on the stand for an hour. When she stepped down, something had shifted in that courtroom. You could feel it in the quality of the silence. The particular silence of a crowd that has revised something. Margaret Tilson, who had been sitting 3 rows back with the ladies' auxiliary in what appeared to be a formal display of opposition, said nothing when Delilah passed her. But she was looking at her hands when Delilah went by, which was different from the way she'd looked at Delilah every other time their paths had crossed. Crow was convicted on all primary charges. The federal sentence meant he would not be returning to Cedar Falls or to this territory in any meaningful capacity. His properties were subject to legal proceedings that would take months to fully resolve, but the outcome was clear. The empire he'd built through 2 decades of slow, methodical pressure on the people around him was going to be disassembled with the same methodical patience. It was not a dramatic ending, There was no moment of collapse, no public breaking. He was led out of the courtroom by the federal marshal, and that was that. A door closing on something that had been a source of fear on this mountain for longer than most of the people in that room had been neighbors. Outside on the courthouse steps, McCready found Delilah and Brock in the crowd. He stood in front of Delilah and held out his hand. She shook it. 40 years on this mountain, he said. Watched 3 men like Crow do what Crow did. Different names, different faces. Watched good people lose their land, lose their hope, sell their life's work for nothing because they had nobody to stand behind. He looked at her steadily. You're the first person I've seen stop one. Delilah held his gaze. We stopped him, she said. All of us. He shook his head slightly. You know the difference between people acting together and people acting together because somebody organized them into it. He released her hand. You're not that humble. Don't perform it. She blinked. Then she said, all right, and meant it. He nodded and walked down the courthouse steps, leaning on his stick, back toward his wagon, toward his 40-year mountain. He didn't look back. Summer came to Black Ridge the way it always came, slowly, grudgingly, the cold releasing its grip by degrees rather than all at once, as if the mountain was reluctant to let it go. But it came. The creek ran clear and fast with snowmelt. The pastures greened up. The cattle that had survived the winter filled out on good grass, and the horses ran the fence lines in the particular loose-jointed way of animals who have been enclosed for months and have suddenly remembered what movement feels like. Clara discovered sometime around the beginning of June that she had legs and intentions regarding them. She was not yet walking. That was months away. But she had developed a ferocious determination to be upright, grabbing at anything within reach and pulling herself up, holding for a few triumphant seconds, and then dropping. She fell constantly and with complete indifference to the falling, getting back up with an expression of absolute focus that made Brock think, every time he watched it, that he knew exactly where she had come from. She's going to walk early, Ruth Halverson said one afternoon, watching Clara haul herself up on the table leg for the 7th time in an hour. She's going to do everything early, Delilah said, not looking up from the bread she was making. She's been trying to get somewhere since the moment she was born. Wonder where she gets that from, Ruth said, with the particular dry warmth that had become the register of their friendship over the past year. Delilah pressed the dough with both hands and said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved. It was Ruth, actually, who said the thing out loud that summer that everyone had been thinking but hadn't quite organized into words. They were sitting on the Maddox porch on a July evening, Ruth and Lars and Jonas, Brock and Delilah, Clara sleeping in a basket between the chairs. The valley was lit up in the late evening gold that came to Black Ridge in summer for about an hour before the mountain swallowed the sun, and everything. The creek, the pasture, the rebuilt Petrescu barn visible on the far slope, was in that light. Ruth said, Do you remember what Cedar Falls was calling you when you arrived? I remember, Delilah said. The giant and his fat wife, Ruth said, without apology for saying it, because between them it had been said before and could be said plainly. That was the thing. That was what people called you. I know what people called us, Brock said from his chair, not uncomfortable with it, but not comfortable either. And now, Ruth said, when people in the valley talk about Black Ridge, when they talk about what happened with Crow, when new families come into the territory and ask who to trust, you know whose names come up? Nobody answered, which was its own kind of answer. I'm telling you this not to make you feel good about yourselves, Ruth said, because you're both too practical for that. I'm telling you because it's true and because it matters and because I was there on the platform when she got off that train and I laughed too. She stopped, looked at Delilah directly. I didn't laugh out loud, but I stood there and I thought, oh, that poor woman. And I was wrong about every part of that thought, and I've wanted to say it plainly for a year. Delilah looked at Ruth for a moment. You sent Jonas up the mountain when I needed a rider, she said. That's not the action of someone who laughed. I sent him 3 weeks after you arrived, Ruth said. That's still 3 weeks late. Ruth. I'm saying it. A pause. All right, Delilah said. You've said it. I have, Ruth said, and picked up her coffee with the air of someone who has put down a thing they've been carrying. Lars, who almost never spoke in groups but observed everything, said, The Halverson barn roof still needs patching before fall. Everyone looked at him. That's what I have to add, he said. Jonas almost choked on his coffee. Brock looked at Lars Halverson and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for most of his adult life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific way of a man realizing that the solitude he had built around himself like armor had been protecting him from exactly this. Not from danger, from this. From people on a porch in July, in the last of the evening light, being ordinary and real and flawed and present. He had protected himself from this for 11 years. He didn't know exactly when he had stopped doing it. Sometime in the fall, maybe. Sometime between the creek repair and the meeting around the table and the night Clara was born in the storm, while the mountain did its worst outside and couldn't reach what was inside. Sometime in there, the armor had come off. Not in a moment, not because of a single thing, but piece by piece, the way you only notice a change after it's already happened. He looked at Delilah. She was watching Clara sleep. Her expression the particular unguarded softness that she only let out in small amounts, carefully, as if there were still some part of her waiting for the moment when showing something real would be used against her. That part was smaller now than it had been a year ago. He could see the difference. She had come to this mountain carrying the weight of every town that had told her she was too much and not enough at the same time. She had set that weight down incrementally, the way you set down something heavy. Carefully, in stages, checking each time to make sure the ground would hold. The ground had held. He thought about writing her that first letter 8 months before she arrived. Sitting alone at this same table in winter, composing careful sentences about the ranch and the isolation and the hard winters, warning her 3 times, as if warnings would prepare her for Black Ridge, as if Black Ridge was the thing she needed to be prepared for rather than the thing she was built for. He thought about being wrong. He had a complicated relationship with being wrong. Most large, solitary men did. There was something about having spent years with only your own judgment for company that made errors of judgment feel like a structural failure rather than just a mistake. He'd been wrong about expecting someone soft, wrong about expecting someone who would need reassurance, wrong about being a finished man in a settled life. He was glad to have been wrong. The last of the July light went behind the mountains. The valley below went from gold to blue. Somewhere down the creek line, a nightbird started up. One of the mountain species that only sang at dusk, that Delilah had identified from her books early in the spring and told him the name of, which he'd immediately forgotten but had meant to ask her again. "That bird," he said. She looked up. "The one by the creek. You told me what it was." "A varied thrush," she said. "You forgot." "I forgot," he confirmed. "It's not important," she said. "It's just a bird." "I want to know," he said. She looked at him for a moment with that expression she had when she was assessing whether something was what it appeared to be. "Varied thrush," she said again. "They come through in summer. They like elevation." "Good taste," Lars said. Nobody laughed, but the porch held a kind of warmth anyway. The specific warmth that doesn't come from fire or weather, but from people having stopped pretending around each other. The years that followed were not easy. The record should be clear about that, because easy is not what Black Ridge offered anyone, and Brock and Delilah were not the kind of people who needed to be protected from honest accounting. There were bad winters still. Winters that took cattle and strained the fences and locked them inside for weeks. There were arguments, real ones, over money and decisions and the occasional fundamental difference in how 2 people who are both strong-willed and opinionated approach a shared problem. There was a summer when the crops failed in the eastern section and they ate from the cold store all the way to October. There was a year when Clara, at 7, fell from the barn loft and broke her arm in 2 places, and Delilah set it herself with hands that did not shake, and then went outside afterward and let them shake in private where Clara couldn't see. Nothing was clean. Nothing was resolved once and then finished with. The mountain kept being the mountain, and the work kept being the work, and life on Black Ridge kept being the specific, demanding, unsentimental thing it had always been. But the families stayed. That was the thing that mattered, measured against the years before. The families stayed. McCready died on his mountain at 81, in his own bed, surrounded by people who came because they wanted to be there, not out of obligation, but out of the genuine regard that accumulates between people who have been through real things together. The widow Crane eventually remarried to a quiet man from the valley who had read in the Cedar Falls paper about the Crow trial and come to the mountain specifically because of it, he said, because he wanted to be somewhere with people of that character. The Petrescu brothers expanded their operation and eventually brought over their sister and her family from Europe, which added 4 more people to the mountain community and 1 more language to the conversations that happened around various tables on winter evenings. Jonas Halverson, who had been a 17-year-old boy carrying more responsibility than he could comfortably hold, grew into exactly the man that the combination of his parents' steadiness and Delilah's particular variety of attention had shaped him to be: capable and thoughtful and good with difficult problems. The kind of man people came to with the things they couldn't figure out on their own. He asked Delilah once, when he was 22 and working his own section of land, what the most important thing she'd learned was. He asked it with genuine curiosity, not flattery. Jonas didn't go in for flattery, which was one of his better qualities. She thought about it for a while. "Stop waiting for permission," she said. "That's what most people spend their lives doing without knowing it. Waiting for someone to tell them they're allowed to take up space, allowed to have opinions, allowed to be exactly as much as they actually are." She looked at him. "Nobody's going to give you that. You have to just be it and let people adjust." He considered that. "Is that what you did?" he asked. "On the train platform. When everyone was—" He stopped, not sure how to finish. "When everyone was laughing," she said, finishing it cleanly. "Yes. I didn't feel permission. I felt fear. But I'd learned that waiting for fear to go away before you move is how you end up standing still for your whole life." She paused. "You move first. The fear follows you, and that's better than leading." He thought about that for a long time after, carrying it in the way you carry things that reorganize how you see yourself. There was an evening in the fall of some later year. Clara was 12, all long legs, and her father's stubbornness, and her mother's particular quality of paying attention to everything at once, when a woman came to the Maddox ranch. She had come up from the valley with a wagon and a child and a face that carried the specific exhaustion of someone who has been traveling towards something for longer than the physical journey accounts for. She said she had heard about Delilah Boone Maddox. She said she had heard, in the town she'd come from, that there was a woman on Black Ridge who, and here she stopped and looked at her hands and then looked up, who had come to a place that didn't want her and stayed anyway and built something real, and she needed to know if that was true because she needed to believe it was possible. Delilah stood in the doorway of her house on the mountain that had never wanted people like her, and looked at this woman for a moment. Then she said, "Come in, there's coffee." She sat with the woman for 2 hours. She didn't tell her what to do. She asked her questions and listened to the answers with the full attention that was her particular gift. The kind of listening that makes people feel that what they're saying matters, because it does. She told her some of what the first year on Black Ridge had been, not the polished version, but the actual version. The fear, the loneliness, the disagreements with Brock, the nights in the early months when she'd lain awake wondering if she'd made the right choice. "I didn't know if I'd made the right choice for months," Delilah said. "I still don't know if what I did was brave or just stubborn." "Is there a difference?" the woman asked. Delilah considered that seriously. "Not always," she said. "Not always." The woman left in the late afternoon, heading back down the mountain with something in her posture that was different from how she'd arrived. Not fixed, not resolved, but oriented differently. The way people look when they've been given not an answer, but a direction. Brock was in the doorway when Delilah came back inside. "She going to be all right?" he asked. "I don't know," Delilah said honestly. "That's up to her." She took off her coat. "But she came here and asked the question instead of staying stuck. That's something." Clara was at the table doing her lessons, pretending she hadn't been listening to every word of the afternoon's conversation. She had her mother's quality of appearing absorbed in one thing while actually absorbing everything in the room. "Mama," she said without looking up from her book. That woman called you brave." "I heard her." "Are you?" Delilah sat down at the table and poured the last of the coffee into her cup. She looked at her daughter. This girl who had been born in a blizzard at 5 in the morning with nothing going right, who had arrived furious and determined and had kept on in that direction without apparent interest in moderating either quality. "I was scared every day of the first year," she said. "I'm scared of different things now. Fear doesn't go away. You just get more practice deciding that it doesn't get the last word." Clara thought about that with the serious focus she gave to things she intended to hold on to. Is that what you're going to tell me to do? She said. When I'm scared? I'm going to tell you what I told Jonas Halverson, Delilah said. Move first. Let the fear follow. Clara looked at her mother, looked at her father in the doorway, who was listening the way he listened to things that mattered, completely, without pretending to be doing something else. She looked back at her book. Okay, she said. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Outside, Black Ridge held its ground the way it always had and always would, cold and high and indifferent to the particular lives being lived on its slopes, asking nothing, offering nothing except the hard truth that the mountain had always offered. You are what you do when it gets difficult. Everything else is just weather. Two people had come to this mountain as jokes, as the giant and the fat woman, as the desperate and the discarded, as the people that Cedar Falls had already written off before they had the chance to write their own story. They had stayed. They had built something on this mountain that outlasted fear and outlasted cruelty and outlasted the particular kind of contempt that small people aim at large lives because the largeness makes them uncomfortable. And the thing they built was not a legend. Legends are about people who are more than human. What Brock and Delilah Maddox built was something harder and more useful than that. It was proof. Proof that the place that doesn't want you is sometimes exactly the place you belong. Proof that the strength worth having is the kind that shows up in the ordinary, repeated, unspectacular work of a life. Not in a single moment of triumph, but in the 1,000 small decisions to keep going, to keep showing up, to keep being exactly as much as you actually are. Proof that two imperfect people moving toward each other through a wall of other people's laughter can build something the mountain itself cannot take down. That is not a fairy tale. That is just what happened.